Greetings. So this is a kind of spontaneous live video on what I feel is quite an important and really difficult or challenging topic. So I define first order reality as what we experience before we have a thought about it, before we have an interpretation of it. And second order reality is our interpretations. So interpretations or stories or narratives or mental frames are ways that we represent our experience to ourselves and to others. So anything that we can possibly put into words is automatically second order reality, right? It's a representation of our experience. So first order reality is what presents. Second order reality is our representation of what presents. So if we try to kind of organize it a little bit, first order reality in terms of our human experience, it comes in the form of feelings, needs, and values, where value doesn't here mean a belief, which is second order reality, but rather value is a kind of visceral sense of what matters to you in any given moment. And some things might matter to you over and over again, very frequently, a lot of the time. And then we form beliefs out of a perceived pattern of what matters to us, right? But I would argue that something mattering to us is part of first order reality, like you might experience an emotion like, let's say, frustration. And that emotion might be linked to a need or a longing. Every need is just a form of longing. So maybe we long for, and we often do long for, connection. Connection is a natural part of human embodied consciousness that we long for when we're not experiencing it. Not all the time. And so connection is part of what we value. Connection is something that matters to us. So we can have these experiences like an emotion, a need, a value that can be interconnected. And all of these can be part of first order reality. We can be experiencing this before we have a thought about it, right? You can experience a longing for connection before you have a thought about it. It's not the product of thought. It might be reinforced by thought or justified by thought or interpreted or explained by thought, but it's there, or can be, before you have a thought about it, right? So there's a wide range of emotions that can exist before you have a thought about them. There are some emotions that exist only because of certain thoughts, right? So an easy example would be emotions like jealousy or envy. We could debate this, but they're often the product of thinking about a situation in a particular way. And these are indeed the sorts of emotions that fall away when we're experiencing a radical kind of awakeness. So awakeness, a central feature of what we mean by awakeness, of what we mean by enlightenment, is the ability to distinguish between first order and second order reality, the ability to distinguish between our experience and our interpretation of our experience. Now, this teaching does not amount to saying that second order reality is invalid. That's why I call it second order reality. It's real. Our representations and interpretations of our experience are perfectly real as representations. They can never capture the totality, nuance, complexity, or subtlety of our experience. But nonetheless, they are they have their own reality. So this can be a challenging thing to talk about, and there's certainly teachers out there. One example would be Byron Katie, who simply and doggedly work to help people get free of emotional attachment to their interpretations, to their stories, And I think this is a very important and perfectly valid part of the spiritual enterprise. But it also ends up kind of in a spiritual cul-de-sac, a dead end, which is where we sort of discount our interpretations and discount other people's interpretations of experience. And that leads us to often invalidate each other's interpretations of their experience. But the ability to distinguish between first and second order reality, between experience and interpretation, doesn't require us to dismiss or invalidate those interpretations. It just requires us to see them for what they are. And when we look at this, we discover that every interpretation is not contingent only on the experience that it purports to interpret. It is contingent on much more than that. It is contingent, meaning dependent on and based on the whole of our conditioning and the whole of our past experience. So when we go to interpret any moment of our experience, that interpretation is drawing not just on that moment, but it's drawing on our sociocultural conditioning, our psychological conditioning, and our samskaras, the impressions of prior experiences that are still undigested or unresolved in us. So our samskaras, our impressions of past unresolved experience, influence how we interpret any given moment of our experience. And so does our conditioning, right? The conditioning that comes to us through parents and teachers and friends and media and movies and television and all that stuff, right? It feeds into our conditioning, which partially determines how we interpret any given experience. So when it comes to interpretations, some spiritual teachers, again, like Byron Katie will say, no story is true, no thought is true, and just sort of she makes an absolute statement in that regard, which seems ironic because, of course, the thought that no thought is true is itself a thought, and then you have a self-contradictory problem. And other teachers like Adyashanti try to resolve this contradiction by saying, no thought is absolutely true, right? So I remember when Adya used to say, there's no such thing as a true thought. And then he modified that. For example, in his book, Way of Liberation, he says, some thoughts are truer than others, but no thoughts are absolutely true. And the reason he modified it is what he's trying to say there is that some interpretations illuminate our experience more effectively than others. Some interpretations point to either an individual experience or a universal experience. We sometimes call those spiritual. Nothing really spiritual or unspiritual, but we often call insights into universal experience spiritual, right? And as opposed to individual, which we consider our insights into our individual experience to have a different quality or character than insights into universal experience. And they do it away, but it's not that one is truer than another. It's just that one is more universal than another, right? But regardless, some thoughts or stories or narratives are articulated in such a way to more effectively help people connect with our experience, whether that experience is just individual or universal. So we would say that these thoughts are truer, in the sense of more effective. That's what truth means there. They're more effective at helping others understand, get, grok, sympathize with, empathize with, or resonate with our experience. Okay. Now, when it comes to somebody trying to represent a whole pattern of experience, like if we make an assessment of another person, an assessment of their issues or their psyche or their psychology or whatever, of course, we're doing nothing but representing aspects of our own experience in relationship to that person, right? So in that sense, if whatever diagnosis you give of someone else is indirectly about you, not to say, there's this ridiculous pop psychology, pop culture idea, whatever you say about someone else is true about you. No, it's not that simple, right? It's rather that whatever assessment or diagnosis you give of someone else is and can only be based on your experience with that person. In fact, it's a story about your experience with that person. And the story is, like every story, both true and false, depending on how you look at it, right? So, if you sort of write up a kind of analysis of yourself or of somebody else, doesn't matter, same thing here, in the sense that analysis, let's say we took that analysis, let's say you wrote an essay about someone else's psychology or your own. Every single sentence in that essay would connect to your lived experience in some way, even though a story or a narrative is inevitably a distortion, right? So in that sense, it's false. A story or narrative or interpretation is inevitably a distortion in a couple of senses. One, because it's partial, it's fragmentary, right? You can't ever tell the complete story because that would be, to account for every single nuance of experience is impossible, right? You can't tell a complete story. You're only going to tell a fragmentary story, and somebody else who witnessed the same events would tell a different story because they're choosing different fragments to focus on. So it's distortive in that sense, but it's also distortive in the sense that the spin that we have on any given event or series of events or dynamic between people, that spin is spun by, again, our samskaras, the totality of our past experience as well as our conditioning. So it's distortive in that sense. So every story or interpretation, again, is distortive in these two senses, because it's fragmentary and because it's spun. We can't help but spin. We're all, when we tell stories, we're all spin doctors, right? We're telling the story of our experience, but the way we understand that experience is profoundly influenced by everything we've ever thought and believed and experienced up to that moment, right? And that's why we get different stories, different interpretations, but I want to point out that this is the most fascinating thing about the nature of consciousness when it goes to represent its experience, is that every single story we could tell is simultaneously false and true. False in the senses I already described, but true also in the sense that if we bothered to unpack it, every single sentence with which we represent ourselves or with which we represent others corresponds to some aspect of our lived experience, even if it's a distorted representation, because it inevitably is, even with the best of intentions. There's truth value to everything we say about our experience, because every sentence can be linked to some specific moment of experience, but it's also interpreted, and that interpretation can't be anything ever but an interpretation. So the reason why, some teachers will say, thoughts are not true, stories are not true, is they're trying to say simply, second order reality is not first order reality, right? So we have this teaching, you are not your story about yourself. Everyone in your life is not your story about them. Life itself is not your story about it. The world is not your story about it. Whoever, anyone, even when you have very strong, charged and thoroughly considered stories, the person that they're about is not your story about them. Which is not to say your story has no value. It's not to say that it has no relationship to reality. Of course it does. The teaching here is simply, if you confuse first and second order reality, then by definition, you're asleep. It's the opposite of awakeness. And we can be awake in some dimensions of our lives, by the way, and asleep in other dimensions, right? Because with some aspects of our lives, we might not confuse first and second order reality. And then in other aspects of our lives, we do confuse them. So whenever you act as if someone is your story about them, that your story about them is just true, that is confusing first and second order reality. That your story about them is a true description of them. And yet, right, there's a spiritual bypassing that happens when we then, go and discount our own story or somebody else's story about us. So somebody might tell a story about us that we don't like, and then we might say, "I'm not your story about me," right? And that's perfectly true. But it's also the case that that person's story points to, or is an attempt to point to, real aspects of their experience with you. So when they're telling a story about you, they're trying to point towards aspects of their experience with you, and that should not be discounted or dismissed, right? That would be a form of spiritual bypassing. So if part of awakeness is our ability to repose in the inner truth that you actually viscerally know that you're not your story about yourself, and you're not anybody else's story about you. Now, if you actually know that, then you don't need to discount their story, right? It's only when you're trying to get yourself to believe that you're not their story about you that you bother to discount it or invalidate it or dismiss it, right? And when you know that you're not their story about you, then you can listen to their story. They're sharing about their experience with you. And their image of you might not fit your image of yourself, but that doesn't make it untrue. It's true insofar as it points to aspects, fragmentary, yes, distorted by their conditioning, undoubtedly, but still it points to aspects of their lived experience in relationship to you. Okay? So one problem, if you will, in our current discourse, in our current cultural discourse, is that since most people don't really get the difference between first and second order reality, most people will take your questioning of their story as an invalidation of their experience. So, in other words, let's say somebody tells their story about you or about whatever, anything, the current political scene or whatever, and then you question their story. Well, if they are really kind of, if they feel the relationship of their story to their lived experience as a sort of emotionally charged reality to them, then when you question their interpretation of their experience, they react as if you are questioning their experience. So, I mean, this happens much more often in interpersonal stuff, but it can happen with anything, where you go to question their interpretation and they say, "Hey, that's my experience." And they're not clearly saying that it's not their experience, it's their interpretation of their experience, which is always open to question. Now, that doesn't mean it's your place to question it, right? Because questioning somebody's interpretation of their experience is valid when they give consent for that, you know. It's also valid when it's coming from an actual place of curiosity, like, I'm not sure about this interpretation you've offered. I'm curious what's underneath it, you know. Again, consent is always necessary for these conversations to not go off the rails, right? When your family members or whoever, your loved ones, tell their story and you question their interpretation of their experience without their consent, it's never going to go well, even though you might be totally right, you know, in that questioning. So there's a problem that we have these days. You know, now we have a relatively new cultural term of discourse, gaslighting. Gaslighting is when you undermine someone's interpretation of their experience so cleverly or thoroughly that they begin to doubt their own experience, right? So gaslighting in its worst and most obvious form is when you sow seeds of self-doubt in the other person by questioning their interpretation and their experience, and imply that they are crazy. You know, so the term gaslighting comes from a 1943 classic film, which is a really amazing film. I've seen it twice, which of course depicts what we now call gaslighting after that movie, though for whatever reason we didn't have this word as a specific term of discourse until recently, even though the movie's been around 75 years. And it is a very important thing to start to sort of wake up to in our relationships, how we undermine each other, you know. But there's an important difference between questioning somebody's interpretation of their experience out of curiosity and care versus questioning their interpretation as a manipulative attempt to systematically undermine their confidence in their own contemplative or thinking process, right? So that's how I would differentiate it, that gaslighting is a manipulative act. Gaslighting is trying to center your own position at the expense of theirs in order to bring about whatever kind of result that you want. It's often power. Gaslighting is an attempt, it's a bid for power in a relationship. But we have a very, 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 very fine line here, which is easily blurred, which is that nowadays it's also happening that questioning the other person's interpretation of their experience gets labeled as gaslighting, even when it's simply questioning. And of course, I think we all have to look at ourselves very carefully, because it may be the case that we are making a bid for power in the relationship and manipulating without even realizing that we are. And we've got to take a hard look at that, you know. But it is at least possible to question someone's interpretation of their experience without doing it as a manipulative bid for more power in the relationship, or as a manipulative bid to center your own experience or interpretation at the expense of theirs, right? So disagreeing is not in and of itself gaslighting. Questioning and doubting their interpretation is not in and of itself gaslighting. And but the reason it's hard to talk about is because it requires us to look into this very, very difficult and subtle thing of where are we actually coming from? And sometimes we don't even know where we're actually coming from. So the question to ask ourselves is, am I coming from an honest desire to know the truth? Am I coming from care for myself and the other person? Am I coming from curiosity to see what happens when we dig underneath these stories and interpretations a little bit to the lived experience, to the first order reality of what's happening before we have a thought about it? You know, what's alive in us? So, I mean, this might not seem to directly relate to tantric philosophy, and yet it does, because what we have in tantric philosophy is this very central notion of vikalpas, or mental constructs, right? Which are, among other things, the stories we spin about our experiences. And this invitation, not only in Tantra, but in all of yoga, to learn how to experience first order reality and to distinguish between first and second order reality, between what presents and how we represent it. So I would make the argument that the most meaningful definition of awakening, because we can define it several ways, but one of the most meaningful definitions of awakening is precisely this ability to distinguish, right? And if it's something that's available to you, this ability to distinguish, and not so available to your interlocutor, the person you're arguing with or discussing with, then that can be frustrating, right? And the other person might perceive you as positioning yourself as having superior knowledge or wisdom, because you're trying to talk about discerning something that doesn't make sense to them. And indeed, if here you are trying to talk about discerning between first and second order reality, that can strike some people as a kind of insidious attempt to manipulate them, even if it's not. And the sad truth is, of course, maybe it is. maybe you've had a glimpse of the difference between first and second order reality, and maybe now you're trying to leverage that for advantage in your relationships. Maybe you're trying to leverage your own sense of having superior insight to your advantage, right? So this stuff gets very complicated very quickly. Questions, comments, objections are very much welcome. These are challenging issues to negotiate, right? Because even though first order reality is always simple, second order reality is always complicated. And teasing out the precise relationships between our mental structures of representation with that which they seek to represent is one of the most difficult things we can do. And it calls on all of us. It calls on our intellectual capacities. It calls on our intuitive capacities. It calls on our capacity for self-reflection, for clear self-reflection, which is often not nearly as available to us as we would like to think it is. So it's literally one of the most challenging things we can do. The easy part is seeing, which is still very rare, extremely rare, but still the easy part is seeing the difference between what presents and representations of it, experience and interpretation. The hard part is then seeing clearly the relationship, the tenuous threads that connect various aspects of the representation to the experience itself in highly complex and nuanced and subtle ways. Yeah, if anyone had figured out a way to represent reality perfectly and accurately, we would have all converted to that language by now. There is no such way, and it won't be discovered simply by the nature of language itself. Stuart mentions about the numerous connections between nonviolent communication as taught by the awakened being, I think he was an awakened being, Marshall Rosenberg, and non-dual Shaiva Tantra. Both the recognition of first order reality and second order reality and the approach to questioning others' interpretations. Yeah, and it's because of the sort of toolkit of NVC, nonviolent communication, that I organize first order reality in the way I do. There's more to it, but in terms of our human experience, it's instructive and helpful to talk about feelings, needs, and values as part of first order reality. Again, values not in the sense of beliefs, but in the sense of what matters to us before we even have a thought about it. Which maybe is just the same as needs. Maybe values and needs are just a different way of talking about the same thing. So it's unfortunately true that certain conversations, I mean, if you have clearly discerned, at least in a moment of insight, if you've clearly discerned the difference between first and second order reality, and you're in conversation with someone to whom that distinction is theoretical, the conversation is never going to be particularly productive, unless you simply are willing to play the game, and sometimes it's important to play the game of validating elements of the other person's interpretation. And this is not disingenuous, because again, interpretations are not disconnected from reality. They're connected to reality, although in very complex ways. They're connected to not only the reality they purport to represent, but also to everything else in the person who's making the representation. Okay? But it's important to realize that not only your interlocutor, but you yourself might see this difference theoretically more than you have actually woken up to it. Because anyone can be persuaded of the theoretical validity of a difference between experience and interpretation. But just because you understand that theoretically doesn't mean you actually get it, right? So because what we're talking about here is grokking something non-conceptually. We're talking about the non-conceptual clear seeing of the difference between experience and interpretation. When this awakening happens for real, it radically impacts your life. It radically transfigures your experience of reality in ways that are quite difficult to describe for obvious reasons. But that's one way of knowing, is this just theoretical for me or not? Because if you see the difference between first and second order reality, then you're like, holy shit, nothing is what I think it is. I mean, all the way down to anything like a tree. A tree is not my concept of tree. And then you're like, well, what actually is it? And then you're like, I don't know. That's weird. I don't know what anything is. What is anything apart from my concept of it? And then if you really sort of click into this, you get launched into this sort of world of profound, wondrous unknowing that doesn't, again, render meaningless, well, not wholly meaningless, all your interpretations, right? Because again, those interpretations might have value in terms of teasing out how they connect to reality. Jessica asks, first order reality doesn't have to be ultimate reality. Depends what you mean by ultimate reality. I mean, one way of saying it is everything is ultimate reality. It's ultimate reality manifesting as that. So ultimate reality manifests as everything we experience before we have a thought about it, and then it manifests as all our thoughts about it and all our interpretations of it. There's nothing but ultimate reality. That's why it's ultimate. So people have this idea of ultimate versus relative. There is no relative truth. There's only ultimate truth. But it can be a useful kind of distinction just in a heuristic sense, meaning talking about the relative value of interpretations or thought constructs to illuminate aspects of our experience in meaningful ways or in ways that we can act on beneficially. Even though those thought constructs themselves are not truth. Obvious example being spiritual teachings. Right? Anyway, maybe this video is already long enough. Maybe we can discuss it more in the comments thread. And there's no end to how deep one can go with this contemplation. But I just invite you to explore it and consider it for yourself. First order reality is whatever's happening, anything and everything that's happening before you have a thought about it or interpretation of it. Second order reality is all your interpretations. And both need to be given their place. One definition of the process of awakening that somebody said is allowing everything to adopt its proper place. Interpretations have their place. It's just when we confuse one category with the other that we get into real trouble. So I know for myself, and I invite you into this as well. When I am centered in the truth that I am nobody's story about me, then I don't feel hurt by anyone's story about me. In fact, I feel curious. Wow, I wonder what elements in their experience made this into a meaningful and valid story for them. When I'm centered in the truth of being, I don't need to discount anyone's story, even though I disagree with it maybe, right? I might say, oh, well, you're remembering that incident differently from me. But that's not to say I'm right. There is no right in this dimension. There's just how you're remembering it and how I'm remembering it. There's no objective reality, There's just what we experience. I'm talking about in the realm of human relations, right? There is objective reality in terms of, things like physics, which measure what we all have in common. They measure the measurables that we all have in common. Physics does not measure the immeasurables that we all have in common, right? Anyway, maybe that's enough for now. May this contemplation be beneficial, and may it help all who hear it to experience freedom. Om.